Welcome to Talking Brains. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis at stephaniesarkis.com. On this episode, I'll be talking with Dr. Jeremy Gase about parallel co-parenting, which is helpful for co-parents who have difficulties getting along. We'll also be talking about the different levels of conflict in co-parenting relationships and how to determine which co-parenting approach is best for you. Dr. Gase is featured on a previous Talking Brains episode on collaborative divorce and co-parenting. He's a licensed psychologist and certified family mediator based in Tampa, Florida. He's a member of the International Academy of Collaborative Professionals, the Florida Academy of Collaborative Professionals, the Tampa Bay Academy of Collaborative Professionals, and Next Generation Divorce. Dr. Gase is the author of A Clear and Easy Guide to Collaborative Divorce and the co-author of Mindful Co-Parenting, A Child-Friendly Path Through Divorce. In addition to his work with Tampa Bay Collaborative Trainers, Dr. Gase is a national speaker on divorce-related parenting matters. Please click that subscribe button and give Talking Brains a rating. It's appreciated. Enjoy the podcast. So I'm talking to Dr. Jeremy Gase, and you may remember Jeremy from a previous podcast where he talked about collaborative divorce and co-parenting. And today we're going to talk about parallel parenting. I've noticed more parents talking to me about parallel parenting, and it seems like it's been around, but probably more talked about lately. So thank you for joining, Jeremy. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And tell me a little bit about what parallel parenting is and how it can help parents where there's maybe one or two people that have high conflict styles.
Sure. Well, parallel co-parenting is really a pretty simple concept. It means that you take care of things during your time, I take care of things during my time. We communicate really only as we need to about the children, but I don't get into your stuff, you don't get into my stuff with the kids. And so one way of thinking about it is if you imagine a train, a railroad track, and you've got the two rails and they're both going in the same direction, but the rails never touch, they never meet. So that's what parallel co-parenting is like. One parent will parent in their way during their time, and the other parents in their way. But the idea is you're both moving in the same direction. You both value many of the same things. You want the kids to be healthy. You want the kids to be happy. You want them to get a good education. You want them to have, good food and good sleep and good friends. But you make the decisions during your time, and I make the decisions during my time. And we only have to discuss decisions when they're really major decisions that have an impact on the children, regardless of which home they're in.
And in a parenting plan, when you do parallel parenting, would it say, for instance, for medical decisions that whichever parent the child's with makes the final decision? What does it look like? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, in most parenting plans, all of the decisions that we call day-to-day or routine decisions are made by whichever parent has the children at that time. And that's true regardless of whether you're going to use cooperative co-parenting or parallel co-parenting. The major decisions, for example, does a child need to have braces from an orthodontist? Do they need to have a particular surgery? Decisions about education, should they be held back a grade or should they be promoted, skip over a grade? Those are major decisions, and really regardless of what type of parenting approach you're using, those decisions are to be made jointly. There are some circumstances when a parenting plan is written that will give decision-making authority, maybe for everything or maybe for particular aspects of a child's life, to one parent or to the other. We call that either divided decision-making or sometimes it's sole decision-making. But those are far less common forms of decision-making in parenting plans. The vast majority of parenting plans have the parents sharing the decision-making for all major decisions.
And how does the parent plan look when you have parents that maybe whenever they're on the phone, they get into a conflict? What could the parenting plan say to avoid those situations as far as communication?
The parenting plan can certainly outline any kind of structure or rules for communication. So you can be as explicit and detailed as you'd like as to the limitations of how the parents will communicate or when the parents will communicate. But generally, that's not all that detailed in a parenting plan. The real issue is when will the parents communicate and about what issues? And that's where your co-parenting approach comes into play. In cooperative co-parenting, we expect there to be a fair amount of communication between the parents. It's more than just an communication as needed approach. Oftentimes there's communication just to check in with each other, to fill each other in, to ask to trade certain days in the schedule, to ask favors of each other, to offer assistance to each other. All those kinds of things we can do in a cooperative co-parenting approach because there's a very low level of conflict between the parents. So communications don't tend to go awry. When there's a higher level of conflict, we need to use a parallel co-parenting approach, which really limits the communication to those things that are essential. So if I'm the parent, I'm only going to communicate with my co-parent when there are things that I have to convey or where there's something really essential that has to be addressed. I'm not going to call the other parent and say, hey, can we switch this weekend because I really want to do this? Or, hey, do you mind if I pick the kids up early so I can take them here? In parallel co-parenting, we have lines. And you do your parenting during your time, I do my parenting during my time, and we really communicate only on a very as-needed basis.
Like, for instance, like an exchange point, well, I'm going to be an hour late, so that would be something that would be appropriate to communicate with. But day-to-day, a kid's grade in a class maybe wouldn't be something that you would communicate about. So it just depends, I guess, on the parents and the priority of...
Right. Well, that is part of it. But I would say that even I'm going to be an hour late, that's not a problem when you have a cooperative co-parenting approach. When the conflict is low, you're pretty flexible, you work with each other. In a parallel co-parenting approach, when we really have to have clearer lines, we work really hard to make sure that you're not going to be late an hour. So if your parenting time starts at 4 o'clock, the expectation is at 4 o'clock, you will be there ready to pick up the children. Now, of course, life happens, and there will be circumstances where things, occur out of our control, in which case, yes, you would have to communicate because that's something you obviously have to communicate. I'm going to be an hour late, and then you carry on from there. But the whole point is that in a parallel co-parenting approach, where we have moderate to high conflict, we're trying very hard to keep parents from becoming reliant upon each other's actions in order to function on a daily basis. So we try to make sure everyone's punctual. Our communication is limited to that which is needed. We don't ask to trade dates or switch times or have late pickups or early drop-offs. You have a plan, you stick to the plan, and you both do your best parenting within those hours.
And when you have a couple that are co-parents that have had a history of high conflict, when you meet with them, how does that go? Because I know some people haven't done parent coordination before, and I strongly recommend it in many cases. So what does that look like when someone meets with you? And I know you also have a book, too, on parent coordinating and collaborative parenting as well.
Sure.
So what would they expect?
Let me tell you about what to expect, because I think that's a great question to be raising for your listeners, because it can seem at best mysterious and at worst intimidating and scary to think about what's going to happen if we were to hire a parenting coordinator. A parenting coordinator is really just a co-parenting consultant who has been appointed by the court to serve in this capacity. So I can meet with people without having a court order, in which case I wouldn't technically be called a parenting coordinator. I might be called something like a co-parenting consultant. And many folks come to me and work with me on a very voluntary basis, and the court's not involved at all. If the court is involved, if there is a formal court order appointing me as a parenting coordinator, it will spell out all the different aspects of my role. But in either case, whether I'm serving as a parenting coordinator or as a co-parenting consultant, the process really looks very similar. The parents contact me, and I set up an initial individual meeting with each parent. That meeting usually lasts about an hour. We typically meet at my office, and they have that hour to share with me their perceptions of what's happening in the children's lives. Where are their problems? What are the things they're hoping to make better for the children? It gives me an opportunity to explain how the process works, what the rules are, and how I generally approach these types of things. And we can actually start to even do a little bit of problem solving, thinking ahead as to what kinds of things might we approach in the first joint meeting. After I've met with each parent individually, separately, we do then schedule a joint meeting in most cases. Occasionally, parents have such high levels of conflict that they can't really be in the same room at the same time, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time, we can meet together. And so the three of us sit, and I pull out a big whiteboard, and we jointly create an agenda. So I ask each parent, what are the issues that they're wanting to resolve? We create that agenda, and then in that meeting and in subsequent meetings, we are working the agenda. We are talking about what concerns there are, what issues, what problems, and I ask to hear from each of the parents with their views. We do a certain amount of back and forth in which I'm very much helping to structure the conversation, and then we try to determine what actions can be taken to make the children's lives better. So if there's an issue about communication between the parents, we talk about some rules for communicating or some methodologies for communicating that might make it go better. If there's an issue about whether a child should play on a soccer league or not, we talk about the pros and cons, and we negotiate some kind of an agreement that both parents find acceptable. And we continue to do that throughout the meetings until the parents feel that we have resolved the issues that they had brought to the process. So that's pretty much what a parenting coordination process looks like.
So it sounds like it gives parents a lot of hope that they can keep their children happy, healthy, and safe, and the other parent may be on the same page.
That's the goal.
Okay. And I have worked with parents that their county around the country doesn't really do parent coordinating referrals. What would you recommend in those cases? I don't know, that's kind of a tough question, but
yeah, no, it's a good question. The recommendation would be seek out a specialist, someone who has expertise in working with families who are going through a divorce or have completed a divorce and who have higher levels of conflict, particularly if you have high levels of conflict. Some folks come to see me as a consultant even if their levels of conflict aren't that high. They just want to figure out the best ways to manage things for their children, and that's wonderful. But it's important, if you do have a higher level of conflict, to seek out someone who has expertise in working particularly with families with that situation, because really it is an advanced area that you want someone who has not only the training but has some good experience in working with those families. And so they don't have to be a court-appointed parenting coordinator. They don't even have to have that label, but it needs to be a mental health professional with expertise in that area, and then set up an appointment with them, meet with them, tell them your situation, and see if they might be a good match for you.
And they might be able to help you complete the parenting plan then.
Yes, if there's someone who has experience with parents going through divorce, then they should be able to help prepare a parenting plan. Now, there are therapists, family therapists, or couples therapists who could also be very helpful, but not all family or couple therapists have expertise at working with families going through divorce. So the question that you want to ask the provider when you're considering them to help your family is this an area in which you practice? Do you have expertise and experience working with families, especially parents in conflict who are going through a divorce or have divorced? Have you drafted parenting plans before? Is high conflict an area in which you have expertise? It's really important to ask those questions, because if you simply were to call a provider or a mental health professional and say, hey, we're having some problems in our family and with our children, can we meet with you? They may be very happy to meet with you, but once they find out what they're dealing with, they may then tell you that that's outside of their area. So you don't really want to get started with someone unless you know that they have the skills to help you out.
That's great, the questions you can ask. So just to make sure I've got this right. So is this an area in which you practice working with high conflict parents, and have you drafted parenting plans before? So those are the questions
Absolutely.
that you want to ask. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you work on co-parenting matters? Are you experienced at dealing with high conflict? Have you drafted parenting? Have you helped develop parenting plans before? If the person is a parenting coordinator, which means they would have taken certain training and they may even be considered qualified within certain circuit courts, then you're probably on pretty solid ground. If the person does not work as a parenting coordinator, but they say, I do work on all of these issues, they may also be a good option for you. But if you do speak to someone and they don't have familiarity in those areas, and they say, well, I think I might be able to help you, but they don't have that expertise, I would be very cautious, because very well-meaning therapists can get very tied up in the challenges that come with high conflict. They won't know how the court system works. They may not know what needs to be in a parenting plan. And you really want more than someone who can help walk you through a checklist. You want someone who can help you see beyond that and really figure out how to customize a plan for your family.
And it sounds like if that person doesn't specialize in it, they may be able to refer you to someone that does.
Hopefully so. And it's certainly appropriate to ask the question, do you know of professionals who specialize in this area? And I think as much as possible, you want to go to someone who specializes in this area, because it's not easy work. It does take a certain personality type to be successful in it. And there definitely is a wealth of information out there. And so you want someone who really knows a lot about how to get the job done and get it done efficiently.
Now, that's a good question. So what kind of personality type makes a good parent coordinator?
That's a great question, Stephanie. There are some of my colleagues who would say there must really be something wrong with you that you enjoy doing this work so much. The truth of the matter is I really like to help to make peace between people. I remember even as a kid, trying to bring people together if they were arguing and trying to get them to work things out. So one is essential characteristic is that you want to be someone who really wants to find the peace. Doesn't mean you're going to ignore the challenges or ignore the reality, but you're willing to work and be persistent to try to find outcomes that work for everyone. So that's one thing. A second thing is you have to be exceedingly patient, because just because you know the right way to do things or what you believe is the right way doesn't mean everyone's going to get there, and especially on day one. So you have to be willing to work with people over time to help them recognize what changes need to be made and to help kind of coach and support them to make those changes, because sometimes those changes are very difficult. So that's a second thing that I think is very important. And I think a third thing is you have to be really good at remaining impartial. You cannot be judgmental. You cannot take sides. You have to really be good at this. You have to either have it in you or you have to develop the skills to be able to hear two perspectives that often clash, and hear people for where they're at and then help them move to a better place without judging or belittling anybody's perspective or ignoring somebody's concerns. Just because someone believes something that may not fit with reality doesn't mean it's not the reality as they perceive it. So you really have to be able to be patient with that, non-judgmental, and just focused on trying to find the peace.
And that's where the patience comes in too, right? So even if you don't agree with somebody's worldview, that's where they're at.
Absolutely. And you may never change that view. Mm-hmm. So then you have to be willing to persist to help them make what changes they are willing to make the situation better. I wish I could say that every family comes in, we take them from wherever they're at and we get them to 100% and the kids' lives are fantastic. I wish I could say that, but I can't. There are a lot of folks who come in And right at the start, I can tell you, I can tell them, it's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be close to perfect. But what I say to them is, if you're willing to put in some time, some resources, and some effort, and we can make your children's lives 50% better, wouldn't that be worth it? And I think the answer is always yes. And then sometimes the situation's so difficult, we say, well, what if we could only make your children's lives 20% better? And my argument is, if we can do anything to make our children's lives better, and I mean meaningfully better, not just a little more comfortable or a little happier, but I mean healthier, emotionally healthier, ensuring that they can have good, healthy relationships with both parents, that's worth an awful lot in my book. So our goal isn't always to get to 100%. It's to get as far as that family can go and as far as those parents are willing to get.
And that's a really important point. This isn't a panacea. And it sounds like the way you present it is optimistic yet realistic.
Very much so. It's definitely not a panacea. In fact, a lot of what we do in parenting coordination with families that have a lot of conflict is we're really looking to manage the situation more than we are to completely resolve. It's sort of like if you have a serious illness that doesn't have a cure, you certainly are going to put a lot of energy into managing the situation. If you might always have diabetes, but if it's well managed, you can live quite well. There might always be some tensions or conflicts between the parents. They may really dislike each other at that point, but we can help them find ways to work together so that the children's lives are as unimpacted as possible.
And it sounds like also you get out of it what you put into it. If you come in with positive expectations, that goes a long way.
Oh, that's really true. If parents come in and they're both really wanting to make things better, then we almost always succeed. If you have one parent who really wants it and one parent who doesn't really want it so much, then that's an uphill battle. And if you have two parents who come in and they really don't want to make things better, they just really want to fight it out, or they want to use you as a tool in court against the other parent, then you're almost guaranteed a failure.
So that leads me to another question. So if you work out a parenting plan with someone, and let's say you reach an impasse or you don't agree on it, I'm assuming you can still be called to court by either parent to testify,
well,
or no?
It depends a lot on your role. If you're serving as a co-parenting consultant or a parenting coordinator, you certainly could be called to court. However, you're not in a position where you can make recommendations about time sharing or really other parenting matters. So you can go in and under the guidelines of the law. So, for example, where I practice in Florida, we have some pretty good rules about confidentiality for the parenting coordination process. So there are a lot of things that I can't be forced to share about what we discussed within the process. But I certainly can give some guidance as to how well the parents worked in the process and what kinds of issues we were dealing with and what kinds of solutions perhaps we were exploring. But I can't answer the question, Dr. Gaze, what should happen? Where should the children live? How much time? That is something I can only do if I have completed a full parenting plan evaluation, which is historically been referred to as a custody evaluation. And otherwise, I wouldn't be able to make those kinds of time-sharing recommendations to the court.
And that also brings up an interesting point that some of the terminology has changed. So when people were kids, and let's say their parents divorced, now they're parents, custody evaluations are now known as parenting plan evaluations.
Well, it depends on your state, your jurisdiction. So in Florida, we refer to them typically as parenting plan evaluations. They're also referred to in statute as social investigations, which sort of means the same thing. There's been some different interpretation at times in that a parenting plan evaluation, which used to be referred to as a custody evaluation, it typically is conducted by a licensed psychologist because psychological testing is included as part of that. However, the definition of a social investigation doesn't necessarily include psychological evaluation, so may be conducted by others who are not psychologists. So it gets a little bit murky, and there's some dispute about all of that. But outside of Florida, in many states, the term custody and custody evaluation is still used. I should make the point that it's not just the evaluation's name, but the very term custody. So in many states, custody can mean which parent has actual physical responsibility for the children, and it might mean also which parent has legal responsibility. In Florida, we don't use the word custody at all, and we actually divide it into two separate categories. We have parenting time, and then we have decision-making authority. So a parent might have a large amount of parenting time, but they might have limited decision-making authority. If perhaps they have a history of making poor decisions, but they're quite competent to provide daily care for their children, they might have plenty of time with the kids, but not decision-making, or vice versa. A parent makes good decisions in general, but for some reason it's not safe or agreeable for them to spend large amounts of time with the children. So they may have very little parenting time, but a large amount of decision making. In most cases, it's more somewhere in the middle. Both parents have, if not equal, at least a large amount of parenting time. So one parent may have 40% of the time, the other might have 60% of the time. But in most cases, they share decision making for any major decision.
I've had parents refer to them being a tiebreaker in decisions. What exactly does that mean when parents say that they're the tiebreaker with medical decision making?
All right, so there are two ways that can work. Sometimes one of the parents is the tiebreaker, and sometimes a professional, like a parenting coordinator, would be the tiebreaker. So when it's just between the parents, you can have an agreement within the parenting plan that says that the parents are required to consult with each other and confer with each other to try to reach an agreement on any major decision for the child. However, if they reach an impasse and they cannot reach a consensus on that decision, then either parent A or parent B has what we refer to as ultimate decision-making authority for that particular matter. So let's suppose it's about medical concerns, and one parent has been given the ultimate decision-making authority for medical decisions. That means they still have to work with the other parent to try to resolve the decision jointly. But if they reach an impasse, then that parent who has the ultimate decision-making authority does indeed have the authority to move forward and make the decision for the child. So if, let's say it's about getting braces, they have to consult and confer, but if parent B says, I don't think the child should get braces, and parent A says, I think they should, and we've reached an impasse, parent A may go forward and hire the orthodontist, and the child will get braces. So that's what ultimate decision-making authority is. Sometimes, however, the parents have shared decision-making authority, but they agree to have a parenting coordinator appointed, and they agree to give that parenting coordinator the decision-making authority for certain types of decisions. So they might give the parenting coordinator the authority to make the final decision after listening to each parent's perspectives, maybe even after gathering information from the orthodontist. The parenting coordinator would make that decision as to whether the child should or shouldn't proceed with braces. In some jurisdictions, it's very common for parenting coordinators to have that level of decision-making authority. In other jurisdictions, it's much less common. So, for example, I live in the state of Florida. Florida is much less liberal about taking decision-making authority away from parents. So it's much less common for me to make any major decisions of that type, whereas in some states, the parenting coordinators are the arbitrators, and they can actually make many of those decisions.
And just in case listeners aren't familiar, arbitrator is someone that just makes the final decision. So if, instead of a mediator that helps everybody come to an agreement, arbitrator, their decision's final, right?
That's exactly
Okay.
right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And going back to parallel parenting, what are some situations in which parallel parenting might be appropriate? And I guess there's a second part of that question. How does a parent know if they're in high conflict? Because I would understand that some listeners are probably going to listen to this and go, oh yeah, my situation is definitely high conflict. What would you say if someone's not sure if they're fall into that high conflict category? What does that look like? And in what situations would parallel parenting be appropriate? So I guess it's a two-part question.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. You're a great interviewer because you're asking the kinds of questions that I know people ask because they ask me the same kinds of things. In terms of high conflict, it really is it's a very broad term. Some people who I would describe myself as having relatively low conflict, they have come to me and described themselves as being high conflict. And some people I've met with who I would say have severe conflict, they describe themselves as having moderate to low conflict. So a little bit of it's in the eye of the beholder, but basically I like to think of three categories. Low conflict means that, look, you may not see eye to eye in everything, but you're able to talk to each other without getting into arguments. You agree on many things, and you're willing to talk with each other and be flexible and help each other out and so on. That's folks who have low conflict, and many families have low levels of conflict. Moderate conflict is when you're able to talk, but sometimes it slips into disagreements or arguments. It doesn't get carried away. It certainly never gets physical. You don't start name calling, but it does get tense. You do get frustrated. You do get angry with each other. You may need to take a break. You don't agree on several different things, and doesn't mean it's always a big blow up, but you don't see eye to eye on certain things, and you kind of rub each other the wrong way, and you don't really enjoy spending time with each other because it does tend to cause some tension. So that's probably more moderate conflict. High conflict is when it seems like no matter what you talk about, if you talk about it long enough, you're going to end up arguing. And the arguments tend to get kind of vocal, maybe a little bit rough. Sometimes you might say the wrong thing. You might get sarcastic. You might yell a little bit. Sometimes it can get to the point where people make threats. They might even get physical. This is what we're calling high conflict. And then, of course, we have maybe a fourth category, which folks are in such severe conflict that they cannot communicate safely. They cannot be in the same place at the same time. And that's a whole nother category that we have to deal with. But high conflict is not that uncommon. It's more common, I think, when folks are going through a divorce and they're really struggling with the stress of the process. Usually when everything's completed, things settle down somewhat, but not always. So now that we have, let's call it the three different levels of conflict: low conflict, medium, maybe medium that's starting to get high, and then your higher and more severe conflict. If we consider those to be three categories, you need a different co-parenting approach to fit each one. I would say that folks who have low conflict can use what we call a cooperative co-parenting approach, where there's a free flow of information. Parents communicate pretty readily, and they're flexible. They can shift time. They can help each other out with things. That's what I would call cooperative co-parenting, and that fits for families with low levels of conflict. The second category, those are folks who have that moderate, maybe moderate to high conflict, not real high, but it's starting to get up there. Those are the folks who need what we call a parallel co-parenting approach, where they will address major issues together, but aside from that, they give each other space, they communicate only on an as-needed basis, and they tend not to ask each other for favors or accommodations. You just kind of stick with whatever the time-sharing schedule is. And then the third category, for folks who have truly high conflict, maybe even high conflict that starts to approach severe conflict, for those folks, there's another form of co-parenting that I refer to as encapsulated co-parenting. What that means is they really need to stay separate. They can't be in the same place at the same time. If they're going to communicate, it really needs to be through a communication website that's designed for parents in high conflict. It really needs to always be in writing. They should never speak on the phone. They should never text each other. Basically, they have to have such strong boundaries that they just do not interact. And of course, that's not a great situation for children, but if the level of conflict is so high, then you have to do something to keep the children and the parents safe. And that's that third category, which is really more for the very high and severe. Within the realm of parallel co-parenting, it can include people at the low, moderate end of conflict, people solidly in the moderate end, and those who are sort of on the borderline between moderate and high conflict. And so you might not be surprised to hear that the families that fall in that center category, which would be the ones that would be appropriate for parallel co-parenting, are the majority of families who have gone through a divorce. The majority of families fall somewhere in that broad middle ground.
And that leads to a question I have, that sometimes parents, when I meet with them, they feel like they're the only ones that are experiencing high conflict or moderate conflict divorces. What would you say to them to kind of normalize it, that this isn't just the two of you that are having this issue?
Yeah, I would certainly empathize and say, I get it. I know it's so hard, but I need you to know you're not alone. That it's very common for folks who are going through a divorce or have gone through a divorce to have some problems, some tensions, some issues. Some of it simply comes from the fact that you're living in two homes. And when children go back and forth between the two homes, that creates some stress for the children, but it also creates some stress for the parents. And it leads to certain misperceptions, misunderstandings, miscommunications. So sometimes it's just the structure of things that creates the problem. And sometimes it's because people are getting divorced. They're getting divorced for a reason. And it's because of a betrayal or a loss or a disappointment, or realizing that the parent that the spouse that you thought was, such a wonderful person turns out maybe not to be the wonderful person you thought they were. And sometimes it takes many years to find that out. But whatever it is that leads you to that place, you're really not alone, because most people experience some of that, and a very large number of co-parents experience enough of that to fall into this broad middle category.
And just to clarify, so low conflict doesn't mean passive. In other words, you can
No.
resolve stuff, but you aren't putting your needs aside. I just wanted to clarify that. Okay.
No, not at all. I mean, my wife and I are married. It doesn't mean we don't disagree about things, and it doesn't mean we don't argue about things. We do. However, when we have a disagreement or when we have an argument, we talk it out, we work it out to the point of resolution, to the point that we say, okay, we're good again now. Mm-hmm. And that's the key to cooperative co-parenting. It doesn't mean everything is easy and smooth. It means you're in a partnership with your co-parent, and you're going to work things out the best you can together. And some things you're just going to learn to accept. But that's true even in the happiest relationships, that sometimes, we just have to accept some things about our partner because that's life. Mm-hmm. That's really what cooperative co-parenting in low conflict looks like. It's not like everything is all, beautiful and a bed of roses, but it means that when problems come up, we'll talk about them, work them out. We have the ability to do that. If you don't have the ability to do that, then you're not going to be low conflict, and you can't use a cooperative co-parenting approach. Now you have to step it up and use a parallel co-parenting approach. And no one should be ashamed about using a parallel co-parenting approach. Some people feel like they're failing because they're not using a cooperative co-parenting approach. Parallel doesn't mean you're not going to try to be cooperative. It means you're not going to rely on cooperation in order to have a good co-parenting approach. It means you're going to rely on your own parenting, and you're going to work with your co-parent as needed to keep the parenting ship on an even keel. It's much better to use that approach if you have moderate conflict than to try to use a cooperative co-parenting approach when you have moderate conflict. Why? Because if you try to use a cooperative co-parenting approach that requires a lot of communication and a lot of flexibility, when you have a moderate level of conflict, you will invariably have those communications go south. They'll end up in conflicts and arguments, and your attempts to be flexible will be met with resentment and frustration when you feel you're being flexible and your co-parent is not. So if you have moderate to high conflict, please don't try to use a cooperative approach with a lot of communication and a lot of flexibility, except that for now, it may change down the line, but for now, you really need to stick with a parallel co-parenting structure.
I think that's going to help a lot of people that you just said that it's okay to do parallel parenting. It does not mean that either one of you has failed. It just means that this is the best option at this point.
Absolutely. Let me give you a great analogy. I actually just used this analogy with a family I met with earlier today. It's like, let's suppose you live in a house and you have a neighbor on one side and a neighbor on the other side. And the neighbor on the north side of your house is just, they're really nice folks, and you have a good rapport, and you can chat with each other, and you can ask each other favors. Hey, do you mind trimming a limb on your tree that's hanging over there? It would really help. Oh, sure. Would you mind if I, park my car in your driveway because they're repaving mine? Yeah, sure, no problem. And you kind of work together and you help each other out and you can chat about things. That's just wonderful. Now, the neighbor on the south side of your property, it's different. They're a little more difficult. They're a little more particular. You don't really have a rapport with them. They're not super friendly. You're really hesitant to ask them for a favor because you've asked them before and they've been really difficult about it. So you've got two sets of neighbors, but you're going to approach them differently. The neighbors on your north side, you're going to have this very friendly, cooperative kind of approach. The neighbor on the other side, you want to maintain peace, but peace comes with boundaries. So you might have a fence between your properties. You might have a hedge that you let grow up 6 feet tall, because it's better when you're not interacting as much. You're not going to go over to that house and ask to borrow a cup of sugar. You go over to the house on the other side where you have a little better rapport. So you can get along with the neighbor on the south side, but you're getting along because you're not going to communicate that much, and you're not going to be asking each other, for favors back and forth. And that kind of détente that you can maintain means you can have a very good working situation, but it's not going to be the same as you will with the neighbor on the other side. That's the difference between parallel co-parenting and cooperative co-parenting.
What a great analogy. And then what would be the neighbor with encapsulated co-parenting? Would that be the neighbor that you just try not to bother at all? And
well, with the neighbor encapsulated, if you don't decide you're going to move away, you absolutely put up a fence. You absolutely, have some trees growing on that side, or plant a big row of bamboo. You stay out of their business. They stay out of yours. You really give them space. That's what you need to do in an encapsulated space. It's much more difficult, obviously, if neighbors are living side by side. If folks have such a severe level of conflict, I would not want them to live in close proximity to each other. Whereas when folks have a parallel co-parenting approach or cooperative approach, I want them to be in close proximity because that's a lot easier for kids. But if folks have such a severe level of conflict and need to use an encapsulated approach, I would much prefer that they live, good 20 minutes apart from each other, so that when the kids are with one parent, they're not going to feel the tension of the other parent just down the road. So you really do need to create the strongest boundaries possible when the level of conflict is that severe. But that's pretty rare. It's a pretty small subsection of the population that has such a high level of conflict that they have to be separated.
But that's a great point, though. When it reaches that level, the proximity, the kids can feel the tension. That's an excellent point.
Yeah, just think about it. Even if you're driving with one parent, past the street that the other parent lives on, even if no one says everything, everyone's thinking it. Oh, yeah, dad lives down there, and mom hates dad, and dad hates mom, and let's just kind of hold our breath till we get past that street. What a terrible way for kids to have to live. But if the reality is that their parents are not able or not willing to shift from that perspective of each other, then better to create as much separation as possible. We still want the kids to have a healthy relationship with each parent, but we don't want the co-parents to have to cross paths in any way whatsoever.
So, and that leads me to my other question too. In situations where there's been domestic violence or now the I guess preferred term is intimate partner violence, I'm assuming encapsulated is the way to go, or does it really differ on the situation?
Yeah, it differs because intimate partner violence or domestic violence, it's not one thing. There are a lot of different types of intimate partner violence, and some types of intimate partner violence require very strict boundaries and separation between the co-parents, and some do not so much. So, for example, during periods at an end of a marriage or during separation, sometimes there's some physical confrontation between parents, but it's often mutual. It can be situationally induced and so on. It's not a chronic pattern. There's not a pattern of bullying. There's not a pattern of control. Those situations tend to resolve pretty much. So even though there's a history, those parents can very easily use a parallel co-parenting approach. When any of those other problematic elements are in place, though, then yes, we would be leaning toward a more encapsulated approach, in part because we need to ensure the safety of whichever parent might be at risk. And sometimes it's the safety of both parents, because it's not only perhaps the physical or emotional safety of one parent, but there can also be false or exaggerated allegations of one parent against another. So the parent who might be accused of being certain things sometimes needs to have that boundary with the other parent, just so no one can make an allegation against them. So in any of those situations, using the high boundaries of an encapsulated approach would be really essential.
And how about with conflict style? Is that something that you're born with in your personality, or is it a thing that you learn? And can you unlearn it too if you have a high conflict personality?
Okay, excellent question. I would say that it's, as in so many things, it's probably a combination between nature and nurture, which means a combination between what you were actually born with and what you learned along the way. Now, a lot of that learning takes place pretty early on. So however we might enter the world as babies, by the time we get through our childhood, we've learned a lot about how to think, how to deal with other people, how to experience the world, how to deal with fear and hope and joy and sadness and anger and so on. So whether we're born with it or whether it comes early in our life, we are wired a certain way as we get into adulthood, and we can change some of that to some extent, but it often takes a good bit of effort. So, if people really want to change the way they handle things, they absolutely can learn to do so, but they have to be very motivated to do so. And in many of the situations that we're talking about, people aren't necessarily that motivated, in part because they have a hard time accepting their role in the problems. It's almost always, well, if you knew my co-parent or my co-parent's this, and the most typical thing in high conflict families is one parent or both parents refer to the other one as being a narcissist. That's kind of not only sort of the popular view, but that's very common because they feel that they weren't heard, weren't treated properly, the other person was selfish or overly self-involved, and that parent didn't care for the kids as much as they cared for themselves. And so kind of the catch-all phrase we refer to is, well, my parent, is such a narcissist. And in many cases, there's some truth to that. Mm-hmm. But again, the point is, if people really want to do things differently, they can learn to do things differently. But many folks coming into this, they're really not coming saying, hey, what can I do differently to make it better? They're coming in saying, fix my co-parent because he or she is a jerk. So that's really the challenge that we deal with when folks come in on these issues.
And I think that really helps too to look at it. That's that piece of, this isn't going to 100% resolve stuff, but if you can get to 20% increase in your kid's quality of life, then that's worth it. It sounds like that's kind of what you're speaking to too, that you can have styles that some of it's you're born with, but there is a portion of it that you can learn. But again, you have to want to learn how to change.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Stephanie. And so if and I'll say this directly to your listeners, if you were to come to me and say, hey, it's really not me. I know you hear it all the time, but it's really not me. my co-parent really is all these things, I might say to you, you know what? I believe what you're saying. You've given me enough information, and perhaps I've met your co-parent at that point, and you're right. This has much more to do with your co-parent than to you. But then I would still say to you, if you want to make your children's lives better, you can't just say, well, that parent's at fault and leave it there. You have to figure out, what can we do to help get your co-parent to a better place? And what can you do despite the challenges your co-parent brings? What can you do to help manage the situation and make your children's lives better? Which doesn't just mean, take care of them in your time and then, say negative things about your co-parent. In fact, that's not helpful. Better is do what you can, and let's work together to help get your co-parent as far as your co-parent is able to go in terms of meeting you in the middle. And again, we're probably not going to get 100%, but if we can get your co-parent to be 20%, 25% more cooperative, more nurturing to the children, more attentive to their needs, more willing to work with you on the children's behalf, wouldn't that be worth it? And many folks would say, I've been through so much with a divorce and I've dealt with this person for so long, I'm just so tired of it. And I get that and I understand it. But if you really take a big breath and you say, listen, I'm going to have to invest this much time and this much money and this much effort, but I can get this parent to meet me 20% closer to the middle, you'd probably say it's worth it, because that's going to save you so much grief down the line. That's a reasonable expectation. And in almost all cases, we can accomplish that at the very least.
And that 20% is huge, because I would think that would make the difference between a kid that winds up getting a divorce themselves or that has a happy relationship. That 20%.
It could make that difference, but what it will most importantly do is today and tomorrow and next week and next month, it's going to make your children's lives a little bit easier, a little less stressful. It's going to give them more of a sense of normalcy. And that's what we're looking for. We all want to make our children's lives as wonderful as they can be. But I think we all accept that life is full of all kinds of challenges, some of which we just can't control. We can't protect our kids from everything. But what we try to do is we try to give them as normal life as we can. Getting divorced doesn't mean that life's not normal, because if you look at the statistics, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of kids grow up with parents who are divorced. So the fact that you're divorced doesn't take away normalcy. What takes away normalcy is higher levels of conflict. So you can stay together with your spouse and say, see, we have a normal life because we stay together. But if you're in conflict all the time with each other, then that's not normal. That's not healthy. And that's not a good way to raise kids. So what we're trying to do is create the healthiest, most normal, in that sense, the most healthy type of environment for children to grow up in. And everything that we're talking about today is about how to take challenging situations and create as much normalcy as possible.
And I really like the point that you point out, that the use of we. So we're going to do this, or we're going to work together. It sounds like there's some comfort in knowing that you're on both parents' side.
Absolutely. I will always be impartial. Look, I might like one parent more than another, just because one parent's a delightful, pleasant, cooperative, likable person, and the other person is really difficult and demanding and so on. But just because I might like one person's presence more than the other doesn't mean that I would favor that parent. My job is to help each parent do what they can to make the parenting and the co-parenting situation the best it can possibly be. And that's, again, where, impartiality is so important. But the we, and you make a great point that the we is what it's about. If I'm working with folks, then it's not just about what are you all going to do. It's about what can we do. You each have your role, but I have a role too. And my role is not in parenting and it's not in co-parenting, but it's helping you all figure out what are the things that are going to make life better, and then educating you, supporting you, guiding you, coaching you, nudging you, coaxing you, reminding you, doing all the things I can to help you be the best parent and the best co-parent you can be. That's my job.
So it sounds like you're kind of a trail guide, so to speak, for healthy co-parenting.
So there's a little inside joke there because Stephanie knows that I very much enjoy hiking and backpacking. And
I didn't even notice I did that.
I love that you did that. And in fact, we went out on a hike together about a week ago and had a wonderful time.
Yes.
So I love that way of describing what I do. And in fact, I think that is a good description for what professionals like myself do. We are like trail guides. We can't tell people you have to walk here, or you have to walk this fast, or you have to get to this destination. But what we can say to folks is, listen, if you're trying to get from this place in the woods to the edge of the clearing, I can show you a few different paths you can take. This one's going to be the quickest. This one's going to be the hardest. This one's going to be the most expensive. This one you're going to have to deal with mosquitoes, and you're going to walk through water, and you have to climb mountains. But if you're willing to do it, that one will get you to the edge of the clearing the fastest. My job is to show you the path, and then to walk along with you, if you're willing to walk the path, to try to get you to the best destination you can get to.
And maybe even give that nudge, like, you can do this. It's just a few steps further. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I am a cheerleader on top of everything else, because I know we can all do maybe a little bit better than we think we can do when it comes to parenting and co-parenting. And so I'm there to show you the way and to give you that gentle push and the encouragement to be your best self. Because if we do that, then your kids are going to turn out great. And isn't that really what you're in this for?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And just to testify, too, that when you say you're low conflict, you actually are low conflict, because we went with your family hiking. So you are low conflict, and you're very pleasant to be around.
I appreciate it.
So I just want to say, you're not one of those people that says you are and you're not. So you actually are low conflict. So, and that also, I understand how people that are high conflict may say they're low conflict, but tell me why someone that's low conflict would actually describe themselves as high conflict.
Well, that's because they may have a very high tolerance for conflict. So if you grew up in a family where everyone was always arguing and yelling and kind of getting into it with each other, you might think that's normal. And so if you're now in a relationship with someone and you don't want to be that way, and maybe they grew up in a similar family and they are averse to confrontation, maybe they avoid confrontation, so they just hold things in, and maybe it stews, and ultimately that has led to some problems in your relationship that's leading you to get a divorce. You might say, well, we're really high conflict because every few weeks we kind of have a little bit of a blow up. But you have to understand that most people who are going through difficult times and have some tensions are going to occasionally have blow ups. So that's really not abnormal. So I think a lot of it is just your perspective, and also your conflict tolerance. For some people, if you simply raise your voice just a little bit, they feel like you're yelling at them, and you're belittling them, and you're demeaning them, and you're abusing them. And then there are other people who you can rant up and down, you can yell, you can threaten and all, and they're not fazed at all. So a lot of it has to do with our own makeup. And if you have two people who both are not very comfortable with conflict, then even small amounts of it might seem unmanageable, and they might label themselves as having high conflict.
And I think, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I'm surrounded by attorneys in my family. And we just kind of verbally spar, not in a fighting way, but in a way to banter. And it's kind of a sport for us. So I could see someone that from a low conflict family, and we're actually kind of low conflict now I think about it, except for someone in the courtroom, that we kind of just banter ideas back and forth. So that's kind of an interesting concept, that you can have that type of interaction, but you can also be low conflict at the same time, because we work stuff out. If we have an issue, we present it and we come to a solution. But I can also see if you visit our family during a family gathering, we sound like we're arguing.
Yep. I love that because Stephanie, that really hits the nail on the head. what is the measure of conflict? It's not, how dynamic or energized
Mm-hmm.
you are in how you engage. Some of that's cultural too. I mean, there are
Mm-hmm.
many cultures in which families sit down at the dinner table and invariably, people are yelling, raising their voice, arguing over politics and
Mm-hmm.
so on. But there's no conflict.
Right.
Nobody's really getting into each other. They're just kind of engaged and energized. And then there are families, sometimes it's just the family, sometimes it's the culture, where people will have dinner. No one will ever say a cross word to each
Mm-hmm.
other, but you can cut the tension with a knife.
Yep.
And I would describe that as a very high conflict family. So it's really
Right.
not quite how you do things. It's really what it means. Are
Mm-hmm.
you, are you, engaging in a way of relating with each other that works out problems and puts issues on the table and gets to a resolution where people can work together and cooperate going forward? That I would say is low conflict. If it's
Mm-hmm.
the other where you can't work together, you can't cooperate, you're kind of undermining each other left and right, I would refer to that as higher conflict.
Well, and that's a great point, that just because you're quiet doesn't mean you're low conflict.
Oh, that's right. Absolutely. In fact, some of the highest conflict folks are folks who just refuse to communicate with each
The
other.
stonewalling. Yeah, I
Right.
noticed that too.
Right.
Yeah. Well, in wrapping up, anything that you'd like to share about parallel parenting, or again normalizing it for people, that sometimes this is just the best way to go, and it doesn't have anything to do with failure or who you are as a person. It's just this is kind of what happens. If you could have some parting words for everyone, just to encourage them that this is something that can be a very normal part of the process.
Absolutely. Well, I'll echo everything you said, and then I'll add to it. I'm a pragmatist, so um, I want to get the job done. I want to just make things better. And that's really the goal I think that we all need to have as parents and co-parents. We're never going to make things perfect. Let's just take the situation as it is and let's do our best to make it the best it can be for our children, regardless of what other circumstances, regardless of what our co-parents like, regardless of our limitations. We all have limitations as well. So the vast majority of parents who go through a divorce or are divorced, they either are now or at some point have needed to use some type of parallel co-parenting approach where they create some boundaries, give each other some space, and kind of function independently. It's a very pragmatic approach, and it is much more effective if you have moderate to high conflict to use parallel co-parenting than to try to use a different parenting approach. Don't be confused by the fact that there's this other approach referred to as cooperative co-parenting. Just because you're working in parallel doesn't mean you can't be cooperative, but it means you have a structure in place, you have boundaries, you keep your communication limited to what's needed, and you try not to infringe upon the time or the relationship of the other parent with your children. You can make that work. And if in time that gets you to a place that you feel the level of conflict has gone down enough that you're able to communicate more fluidly and you are able to flex more, by all means, you can now shift to a cooperative approach. But don't try to do that until your level of conflict has already made a significant change.
Beautifully said. So thank you
Thank you.
so much.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Whenever we do one of these podcasts and we sit down, I think to myself, how are we really going to fill the time? And then by the time we get to the end of it, I feel like, we could go on for another hour or
Right,
two.
it's already been an hour. Yeah, it flies
It has.
by.
The time flies.
Yeah.
You're a great interviewer. You ask the kinds of questions that I know your listeners have in their own minds. And I so much appreciate getting the opportunity to put this information out there because I really want people to have a better experience. And most importantly, I want your children to have the freest, happiest, healthiest, safest lives that they can have in good relationship with both parents and as low conflict as possible so that when they become parents one day, they can pass on a good, peaceful way to live from generation to generation to generation.
And I really appreciate that you're helping parents make that happen.
Thank you. I find it a privilege, and I'm happy to do it every chance I get.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks again for appearing on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Talking Brains. Again, this episode's guest was Dr. Jeremy Gase, licensed psychologist, certified family mediator, and co-author of Mindful Co-Parenting. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis at stephaniesarkis.com. Please hit subscribe and give us a great rating. It's appreciated. Thank you and have a great day.